Welcome. I hope that you can all hear me just fine. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our annual Joakim Dungel Lecture in International Justice. My name is Sari Kouo. I am an Associate Professor of International Law at the Department of Law at the School of Business, Economics and Law. And for a number of years, I've been the focal point for this annual Joakim Dungel Lectures. And it's a task that I'm very fond of because throughout my career, I've been commuting, one can say, between academic work, practice, and policy work. So it's a real pleasure for me to, on an annual basis, try to provide sort of glimpses of what it means to work with international law, to especially the many law students that join us for these lectures. What we try to do each year, and we do this in collaboration between the law school and the Joakim Dungel Association, is that we try to find topics that resonate with the political realities of the moment. Topics that can be approached to international law, but for which there are no easy answers. This year is no exception. The topic that we have chosen to dig into this year is nuclear weapons. Today's speakers are particularly well placed to walk us through the technical, political, and legal complexities of nuclear weapons. We have with us Jens Wirstam of the Swedish Defense Research Agency, who will provide us the necessary technical and political context for the issue. And we have two excellent lawyers, Dr. Gail Lithgow and Dr. Irini Giorgio, who will talk us through the international law and especially international humanitarian law aspects of nuclear weapons. So I'm very happy to be able to listen in today and also later on facilitate the discussion. Before handing over to Emilia Dungel of the Joakim Dungel Association, a few practical issues. The first, we'll do a couple of changes in the schedule. The first lecture will run till around 10 o'clock, and then we'll take a 15 minutes break. And we'll start again at 10:15 for the second lecture. And thereafter we'll go on till around 11:30. I should also say that we will be recording this lecture, and as with the previous lectures, it will be made available on the associations and the law school's websites. Thank you. Over to you, Emilia.
Thank you, Sari. I'm going to just ask our comms colleague Marie to help me turn on my video because I think it's been turned off for the practice session. So excellent. Great. Thank you so much. Thank you, Sari. So my name is Emilia Dungel, and I'm the chair of the Association in Memory of Joakim Dungel. I'm also his little sister. Joakim was an alumnus of the School of Business Economics at Gothenburg University. He was also an alumnus of New York University. He was killed while working as a human rights officer for the UN in Afghanistan in 2011. Joakim's friends and family we founded the association in his memory to continue his work. And we do this by organizing annual seminars to unpack issues broadly related to international justice. So as Sari touched on, we try not to shy away from complexities or controversies, instead working under the assumption that only through understanding, discussion, and dialogue can progress be made. Do have a look at the website for previous editions too. We've covered various issues over the years, and we aim to always have these lectures be publicly available afterwards for those who couldn't join us in real time. I just want to take a quick moment to thank you, all of you who are joining. At the moment, there's about 160 of you here, for joining us today, and to our speakers for sharing their insights with us, and to those who helped make this happen. Of course, Sari Kovo, my co-organizer, Marie Örninge, Jeffrey Johns, and Karin Åberg. In addition to the seminar advisory committee, we could not make this happen without any of you. So thank you very much. With that, let's get started. As Sari introduced, we're going to spend today discussing nuclear weapons from different perspectives. Our first speaker is Dr. Jens Wirstam. Jens is Deputy Research Director at the Swedish Defense Research Agency, FOI. He has worked there on technical aspects related to arms control, disarmament, and non-proliferation of nuclear weapons for more than 20 years. He holds a PhD in theoretical physics from Stockholm University and is currently seconded to the Department of Disarmament and Non-Proliferation at the Swedish Ministry for Foreign Affairs, whose work in these areas is supported by his research. So I can't think of anyone better to provide a technical, military, and political introduction to nuclear weapons. Jens, thank you so much for coming. The screen is yours.
So thank you. It's a pleasure being here, although virtually, and to give this first introduction. I will divide this presentation into three parts. So I will start by briefly explaining why nuclear weapons are special, but don't worry, it won't be a crash course in nuclear physics, but just a very brief introduction. Then I will talk a bit about the international regulation of nuclear weapons, and then end by discussing why states still have nuclear weapons and how these weapons fit into their security policies. And needless to say, everything I express here are just my personal views, and they are not endorsed by neither the Swedish Defense Research Agency nor the Swedish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So let's get started with the first part here, nuclear weapons physics in brief terms. So nuclear weapons are unique weapons. And the reason they are special is due to the amount of energy released, that is the sort of destructive power you have from one single weapon. The energy released from a nuclear weapon is typically equivalent to thousands and even millions of metric tons of normal explosives like TNT, for example. As you all know, nuclear weapons were used over Hiroshima and Nagasaki at the end of World War II. And those bombs were each equivalent to around 20,000 tons of TNT. So the reason nuclear weapons are special is that they have this large destructive power coming from just one single weapon. And the physical reason for this, and this is the 2 minutes of nuclear physics here, the physical reason for this is because in a normal explosive, you release energy from molecular reactions, whereas in a nuclear weapon, you get your energy from nuclear reaction. And in particular, all nuclear weapons depend on the fact that you can release energy by splitting the atomic nucleus and initiate a chain reaction that splits additional nuclei. And this is called fission. And it's the same principle as in nuclear reactors or nuclear power plants. But in a nuclear weapon, this chain reaction, the splitting of the atomic nuclei, is much faster. And that is why you get an explosion instead of just a constant production of energy as in a nuclear weapon plant. Nuclear power plant. So a nuclear weapon works by starting this chain reaction the moment you decide to detonate the nuclear weapon. before detonation, there are no chain reactions. So you also need to ensure that the reactions don't start by themselves, unintended, when you don't want a detonation, because that would obviously result in a devastating accident. So therefore, there are, I would say, in all nuclear weapon states, very rigorous safety and security measures surrounding their nuclear weapons. So that's the physics part. So let's move on to the international regulation of nuclear weapons. Contrary to other weapons of mass destruction, that is chemical and biological weapons, nuclear weapons are not prohibited. However, the possession of nuclear weapons is regulated internationally. And this is first and foremost by the International Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, which entered into force in 1970 and is of infinite duration. So in that treaty, 5 nuclear weapon states are recognized to be sort of legal nuclear weapon states, and that they are the United States of America, Russia, United Kingdom, France, and China. So in this treaty, the NPT, they commit to disarm their nuclear weapons. But you should note that in the treaty, there is no time limit for that. Instead, it's just stipulated that this nuclear disarmament should take place in, quote, in good faith, unquote. So these are the 5 nuclear weapon states in the treaty. All other states parties to the NPT, like Sweden, for example, have forsworn nuclear weapons. And they are thus obliged to remain as non-nuclear weapon states. And to ensure that, they also have to accept that the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA, come and safeguard their peaceful uses of nuclear energy to prevent diversion to a military program. So, for example, in Sweden, the International Atomic Energy Agency will come to our nuclear power plants and see that everything is as it should, and we have not diverted any of the nuclear fuel, say, for example, into a military nuclear weapon program. But to accept this, let's say, burden of having to safeguard their peaceful uses of nuclear energy, they also have in the NPT an inalienable right to the peaceful uses within the treaty. So there is this compromise here that non-nuclear weapon states in the treaty have an inalienable right to peaceful uses of nuclear energy, whereas on the other hand, nuclear weapon states within the treaty are they have to commit to disarm their nuclear weapons. So this treaty, the NPT, has been very successful during its, well, now almost 53 years of existence. And in fact, all states in the world, except India, Pakistan, and Israel, have joined the treaty. And not surprisingly, these 3 states, India, Pakistan, and Israel, possess nuclear weapons, although Israel has never confirmed that. And this is actually the reason they remain outside, because as stipulated in the treaty, India, Pakistan, and Israel can never join the NPT as nuclear weapon states, because there are you have to test a nuclear weapon before January 1st, 1967, if you want to join the treaty as a nuclear weapon state. And India, Pakistan, and Israel did not test a nuclear weapon before that date. If one wants to be absolutely correct, one should also say that South Sudan has not joined the treaty either. But no one thinks South Sudan has nuclear weapons. The reasons for South Sudan not yet joining the treaty is due to other reasons. And Sweden is also party to the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state, as I already mentioned. And you could really say that the NPT has helped to stop the further spread of nuclear weapons, partly because it assures a country, a non-nuclear weapon state country, that also your neighboring countries are not developing nuclear weapons either, because they are also non-nuclear weapon states. So to take a really bad example, Sweden is a non-nuclear weapon state in the NPT, and then it's assuring that we know that Norway and Finland are also non-nuclear weapon states, so they are not developing nuclear weapons. So having said this and spoken a bit about the successes of the NPT, there are certainly challenges to the NPT as well. For example, North Korea, DPRK, has left the treaty, which you have the right to do under the treaty, of course, but they left the treaty and developed nuclear weapons. And the nuclear weapon program of DPRK is getting more and more advanced and diversified as time goes by. So this is obviously a challenge to the international security with regards to nuclear weapons. Iran is another country that had a structured nuclear weapons program 20 years ago, despite being part of the NPT as a non-nuclear weapon state. So they tried to cheat, basically. And today, Iran continues to expand its sensitive nuclear-related activities, which it claims is for peaceful purposes, which you have the right to, although I have to say that it is sometimes very difficult for the outside world to really understand the peaceful context where these nuclear-related activities fit. So that's the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. So let's now move into the politics of nuclear weapons and the reason they still exist. And here I will primarily discuss nuclear weapons in the United States, Russia, and China. And that's because the United States and Russia, they have the largest nuclear arsenals, whereas there are indications that China's arsenal is undergoing a very large expansion. And the aim here is to look at the nuclear arsenals in these three respective countries and try to understand how they fit into their policies, strategies, deterrence, and defense. What role nuclear weapons play in these three states. But to understand why the nuclear arsenals play the role they do, one cannot just be confined to the nuclear weapons themselves. Conventional weaponry is important to understand the nuclear weapon aspects as well. And you could say that this kind of linkage between nuclear and non-nuclear capabilities is getting stronger due to the technology developments of the, let's say, the last 2 decades, something I will come back to in just a few minutes. But the fact that there is this linkage or coupling between conventional and nuclear capabilities is not something new. As an example, starting already in the 1960s, and during the rest of the Cold War, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO had a military doctrine called flexible response, where a conventional military aggression by the Warsaw Pact could be met with limited use of nuclear weapons by NATO. Nuclear weapons with a comparatively low explosive yield, although we're still talking thousands of tons of TNT. And this NATO doctrine came from the belief that the conventional forces of the Warsaw Pact would be overwhelming compared to NATO's conventional capabilities. So NATO felt that they would have to escalate the conflict, if there ever was one, from a conventional war to a nuclear war. And as this example with NATO's flexible response shows, the role of the nuclear weapons and the reason why NATO stated this military doctrine is that it enables you to deter an opponent from taking certain actions. And if that still fails, to be able to escalate the level of military conflict by using nuclear weapons. And here the reasoning is that if deterrence fails and you escalate the level of conflict, you would make clear to the opponent that the losses for that opponent will always surpass any potential gains the opponent could get. And the ultimate deterrence and defense of nuclear weapons is provided by the largest nuclear weapons with the largest destructive power. And these are the so-called strategic nuclear forces. And they are, for example, intercontinental ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads on top of them to be delivered across oceans and continents. So I would argue that nuclear weapons should not be thought of as being only political weapons, as they are sometimes referred to. Rather, they are seen as a tool to manage escalation in military conflicts, as deterrence first and foremost, but also for defense, if or when that deterrence fails. Of course, military conflicts can take place in different geographical contexts as well. You could have different levels of escalation, but it could also be in terms of different geographical contexts. Let's say, for simplicity, on a regional or on a global scale. If we start with a global military conflict, that could escalate to the use then of these strategic nuclear forces, because that is the ultimate deterrence and defense you have. And if you have a global military conflict, a situation might arise when you feel a pressing need for actually escalating the conflict to the level of strategic nuclear forces. And for Russia and the US, this category of weapons is actually also regulated, not within the NPT, but in a bilateral arms control agreement called the New START, where there is an upper limit to the number of weapons each country, the US and Russia, can have with regard to strategic nuclear weapons. And the benefits of having this bilateral arms control agreement, the New START, are two, I would say. First, to avoid an arms race, because if you don't know what your opponent has in terms of capabilities, you might need to take a worst case scenario, and then you will have to expand your own strategic nuclear arsenals, and then you sort of get into this arms race. So that's the first benefit of having this bilateral arms control agreement. Secondly, the treaty is there to preserve what is called mutual assured destruction, which is supposed to preserve strategic stability. This concept, mutual assured destruction, or MAD, if you take the acronyms, which some may think is a rather fitting acronym for mutual assured destruction. This MAD concept builds on the assumption that if both you, as a country, if both you and your opponent have the capability to destroy each other, and here we are talking about really large-scale, massive nuclear weapons use. If you have the capability to destroy each other, regardless of who starts attacking, so regardless of who is first and who is second to use massive nuclear weapons, that fact will eliminate incentives for using these strategic nuclear weapons on a large scale in the first place. So this is the MAD doctrine of how to preserve strategic stability by being certain that US and Russia can destroy each other completely, and that would, of course, also mean the destruction of the global civil society as we know it. And this is the only arms control agreement that is in force between nuclear weapon states, and this New START treaty. But unfortunately, even that single agreement is under stress. And this is because Russia has not accepted the resumption of the verification measures that come with this agreement. They have not accepted to resume these verification activities since they were paused during the COVID pandemic. So of course, if you have an arms control agreement, you need to be able to verify each other's arsenals to make sure that they are that both parties are abiding by their treaty obligations or agreement obligations. So this is the global scale. If we now turn to the regional level of conflict, and that could, for example, be something similar to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. A nuclear weapon state would want to be able to manage escalation to nuclear weapons in that specific regional context as well, without necessarily going to a global conflict or using these strategic nuclear weapons. But you want to be able to manage the level of conflict within that regional geographical context as well. And I think we have seen quite a bit of that in relation to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But if you want to be able to manage escalation in that regional context, and you can't use your strategic nuclear forces, these intercontinental missile forces, for example, you have to have a nuclear arsenal that do not only include these strategic nuclear forces, but also what is typically called tactical nuclear weapons. And these are nuclear weapons that generally speaking, have a shorter range. So instead of going 10,000 kilometers, they might go 500 kilometers or 1,000 kilometers. So they have a shorter range, and they typically also have less destructive power compared to the strategic nuclear forces. Although it should be emphasized that we are still talking on the order of thousands of tons of normal explosives. So what has happened, something that has happened during the last decades is that some nuclear weapon states feel that their ability to manage escalation of military conflicts by using nuclear weapons, that ability has been undermined by technology developments, and that the nuclear weapon states therefore have to expand and diversify their nuclear arsenals and even rely on them more, and potentially in a military conflict be prepared to use them even earlier. And to give some examples of such potentially disruptive technology developments, there has been a development in long range and high precision conventionally armed missiles. So military operations that 30 years ago demanded use of nuclear weapons can now potentially be accomplished by long range, high precision conventional missiles, which sort of, in some people's mind, undermines this kind of ladder of escalation levels, where you start with a conventional military conflict, and then if needed, you might be forced to escalate the level into nuclear use. And this escalation ladder is now being undermined, according to some, by these conventional missiles. And in addition to that, there is this development of missile defense systems, which increase your ability to actually defend yourself against an opponent's use of missiles, including nuclear missiles. And then, in addition, there are other systems like real-time information and communication capabilities, space-based assets, potentially cyber, and in the future artificial intelligence, that could have a potential bearing on the capacity to manage nuclear escalation. So all these technology developments play into how you can manage escalation with nuclear weapons. And to give a specific example,
this meeting is being recorded.
Yes, we know. Russia believes its non-nuclear forces to be inferior to NATO's capabilities, taking all these technology developments into account. And therefore, Russia has developed in the last 2 decades, I would say, a large and diversified arsenal of tactical nuclear weapon systems. And given the performance of Russia's conventional forces during the invasion of Ukraine, as well as the losses inflicted on Russia's conventional forces, Russia will likely feel even more inferior in the future, in the near-term future, and therefore possibly rely even more on their tactical nuclear weapons for potential regional conflicts with NATO, and that's conflicts in Europe or Eastern Europe. And Russia will possibly also be prepared to use them even earlier on in the conflict because of this lack of conventional capabilities. And this clearly has implications for Western Europe and NATO, and including for Sweden and Finland, since they have applied for membership in NATO. So Sweden and Finland will join a defense alliance whose defense and deterrent rests on an appropriate mix of conventional, nuclear and missile defense capabilities, and where the strategic nuclear forces of the US is the supreme guarantee for NATO's security. But contrary to Russia, the US and or NATO have not expanded or diversified their nuclear arsenals in a long time, although there continues to be, let's say, incremental developments. An example of that is the only US tactical nuclear weapon called the B-61 is being fitted with a better and more precise tail kit on the tail of the bomb to make it more precise. So there are incremental developments, but there's not really an expansion or a diversification of the nuclear arsenals. But in light of this worsening security environment in Europe, as well as in East Asia, particularly with regard to Russia and China, but also, as mentioned earlier, DPRK, it remains to be seen if there will be a reassessment of US and NATO nuclear postures. At the same time, of course, it should be emphasized that so far, the circumstances when NATO might have to use nuclear weapons are extremely remote. So this is Russia and the US and NATO. For China, the situation is somewhat different. China is a rising superpower with an increasing interest in controlling or dominating its region around China, and at the same time keep the United States out of that region. So thus, China is also expanding its tactical nuclear arsenal. Traditionally, though, China has kept a fairly small strategic nuclear arsenal. But however, with the probability of a future regional conflict in East Asia, there is also a risk that such a regional war could escalate into first a regional nuclear war and then escalate further into a global war and possibly a global nuclear war. And hence, to avoid being defeated in such a scenario where you escalate the military conflict to the highest level, China is also expanding its strategic nuclear forces. And possibly they are going to triple their strategic nuclear forces within the coming decade. So with this, on this happy note, I finish my presentation. Thank you for listening and hopefully staying awake.
Thank you so much, Jens. I think we've all learned a lot. This was an excellent way to situate us into the topic. So we've had a few questions. We're going to try to do maybe one or two, and then, but we've noted all the rest of the ones and we put them in a document so we can do them during the discussion. Just to mention, we've had two questions on the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, and we're going to deal with this in part 2 when Irini Giorgio and Gay Lithgow discuss this topic from an international law point of view. So we will dedicate more time to this later. So Jens, one of the first questions to reach you was, we talked a little bit about how the control mechanism looks in countries that don't have nuclear weapons, but what is the observation and control mechanism like in countries that do have nuclear weapons? What have they committed to in terms of control? Is the first question we received.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a good question. They have not. So in this nuclear non-proliferation treaty, they have committed to disarm. They have committed to nuclear disarmament, but there is no time limit. It just says that they should pursue nuclear disarmament in good faith, whatever that means. I'm not a lawyer, I'm a physicist, so I don't really know. But that's a commitment, although it's not time bound. With regard to other commitments, they have not committed to any of the safeguards measures or anything that the non-nuclear weapon states have to commit to. So the nuclear weapon states do not have the IAEA safeguarding their facilities. The nuclear weapon states can do what's called a voluntary offer agreement, where they voluntarily offer civilian nuclear energy infrastructure to the IAEA to inspect. But that's a voluntary measure, and typically, given budget constraints, this is not something that the IAEA undertakes with that much of effort. I mean, they do go there, but since this is a voluntary measure and they can offer any infrastructure they want and also not offer any other infrastructure that they don't like to offer, it's more of a good sort of perhaps training ground for IAEA inspectors, I would say. So there is this divide, which is a big discussion when there are review conferences for this NPT treaty regarding the burdens of nuclear weapon states versus the burdens that non-nuclear weapon states have to undertake, etc., etc. So that's an ongoing discussion. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Oh, great, great answer. Just one final question, I think, before we head for a break. And as I said, we've saved the rest of the questions, so we hope to get to them in the discussion part. So we have a question that asks if has it been argued that the Russian Federation today is using the flexible response doctrine in reverse? And if so, how could such argumentation be responded to?
Oh, sorry, could you just repeat the first part of the question?
So the question asks if it has been argued that Russia is using the flexible response doctrine in reverse. And if so, how could one respond to such argumentation?
No, I think this is a correct observation that as NATO did when they at least thought they were they did not have the same conventional capabilities as the Warsaw Pact. They had to rely on early use of nuclear weapons. I think this is Russia's military doctrine with regards to nuclear weapons is a mirror of flexible response, really. So I think that is true, and I do think, I mean, nuclear weapons have played a big role in the and during the invasion of Ukraine, because I think if Russia had not been a nuclear weapon state, I think the support to Ukraine from the West would have been much more forceful already from the start. So I think nuclear weapons do play a role, and this is in fact what you hear the US President Joe Biden say all the time, that we do not want to enter uncharted territories where we risk nuclear war. So thanks.
So I think we're at a moment where we're able to keep time, which is very exciting. So I think this is a good time to take a break. We received a few more questions, so we've saved them here as well. So thank you so much, Jens. I know I learned a lot. I really appreciate that you were also able to situate us technologically, because I feel like often it's assumed that we know what we mean when we talk about nuclear weapons, and I really appreciate that. So this was an excellent way to start. When we come back after the break at 10:15, so we've changed the break for those of you who weren't here at the beginning. We're going to do a shorter break to fit our online setup. So if you come back at 10:15, we're going to talk about international law for about an hour with our two international law experts. So thank you so much, Jens, and thank you everybody, and we'll see you in 15 minutes.
Yes. So welcome back, everybody. And again, thank you very much, Jens, for having set the stage for this discussion. I'm very keen now to listen to Gail and Irini, who will sort of guide us through the international legal scene when it comes to nuclear weapons more in depth. What we'll do is Gail and Irini have 20 minutes each for their presentations. After that, we'll take a couple of sort of specific questions in a relationship to those more legal presentations, and then we go into a questions and answer session with all three speakers. So without too many more words from me, Gail, the floor is yours for about 20 minutes.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and a big thank you to you, Sari, and to Emilia, Marie, and everyone behind the scenes for organising this event. I wish I didn't need to be here to discuss nuclear weapons, but I am very pleased to honour Joakim Dungel in this way. And the reason why I wish I wasn't still having to talk about nuclear weapons is it's a topic I've spoken about and campaigned on for a very long time. One of my very first protests was actually outside the Faslane naval base in Scotland, because where we live in the west of Scotland is in the shadow of a nuclear threat. We were taught in school what would happen if there was a nuclear attack, because Glasgow would be very much a target given the naval base of the nuclear weapons is so close to this population centre. Everyone living in the surrounding areas have lived with this threat and this knowledge. And I used to know exactly, but I recently moved house, exactly the effect that I would receive based on where I live in the city. But I have recently moved house, and I suspect I would just receive first-degree burns, be temporarily blinded, but I would receive a healthy blast of thermal radiation, and I would have seconds to find some kind of shelter, but would likely die from lethal radiation dose. That's where I live. And this is something that's very real to a lot of people. And maybe also because I think Jens had very, in great detail, covered the legal and political and also the scientific side of nuclear weapons. But he did at one point mention that there were incredibly high safety standards at these bases. And instead, maybe I can report that in Scotland, at least, we are very aware that there have been very serious nuclear site events recorded by our Ministry of Defence in the UK at the Faslane and Coalport bases that have risen to 13 serious nuclear site events in 2021. These incidents have been disclosed under freedom of information, and they have included things like radiation leak, coolant water losses, dropping reactor control rods, unplanned reactor shutdowns, and communication breakdowns. So I think so much for this very safe technology. And so today, and I think there were some comments on this in the chat, I'll maybe address a little bit the impact of the TPNW, that's the Treaty Prohibiting Nuclear Weapons, and discuss some of the legal and political implications. And I reflect constantly on my place as a legal scholar and as an activist in this. For many now think that law has taken this train as far as it can go, and it's now down to politics. political persuasion, negotiation, and diplomacy. But that was also the feeling before the TPNW. But certainly there seems to be little point in trying to attain another International Court of Justice advisory opinion or bring a contentious case on the issue. But law has dramatically changed the world that we see today. And we could play, of course, with the dichotomy that exists supposedly between law and politics, and problematize law as just another tool of politics or law as lawfare. But I want to instead discuss, and I will get into a little bit later, just how law and politics will go hand in securing disarmament. But first, I am going to discuss this Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, or the TPNW, and its impact on international law. And there are a number of remarkable things about the treaty, such as the high degree of involvement of non-state actors in the negotiation and adoption of the treaty. ICANN, which is International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, is a civil society organization that won a Nobel Prize for its work in securing the TPNW text. And they're still a prominent organization to this day. And I'm happy to talk about them in more detail, but I thought I might instead use this time to introduce the legal obligations that are on states, and then some topics for discussion. By way of background, the UN General Assembly decided in December 2016 by a resolution to take forward multilateral nuclear disarmament negotiations in the year 2017. For the previous 4 years, resolutions had been passed establishing and progressing the programs of working groups and deciding to keep this item on its agenda. And of course, for many years, the UN General Assembly has been passing resolutions on nuclear weapons. Indeed, the first resolution adopted on January the 24th, 1946, by consensus, established a commission to make proposals for the elimination from nuclear armaments of atomic weapons and all other major weapons adaptable to mass destruction. So in many ways, the TPNW has been a very, very long time coming. In March and July of 2017, there was a negotiation conference that took place. This TPNW was then adopted by the conference with a vote of 122 states in favour, 1 vote against by the Netherlands, and 1 abstention by Singapore. This happened on the 7th of July 2017, and the treaty was opened for signature on the 20th of September the same year. 50 states, 50 being the magic number for the entry into force of the treaty, was achieved by Honduras, which ratified the TPNW on UN Day 2020, so that's the 24th of October, UN Day. And there are now 92 signatories and 68 state parties. And very recently, there was a Rwandan NGO reporting that Rwanda is in the process of signing the treaty. And there are also reports that an Indonesian Parliamentary Commission is examining a bill to ratify the TPNW. And just last week, officials from 37 African states gathered in Pretoria at a regional event to discuss how to ensure that every African state signs and ratifies the ban treaty. Those states that were not in attendance at the negotiation include the likes of the UK, the US, France, and many European states. And so without intending to at all restrict discussion or questions at the end, the first topic I'm going to address in more detail are those legal obligations of states in relation to nuclear weapons, thinking firstly about those existed in the architecture before the TPNW, which apply to all states whether or not they have signed the treaty, and those who have signed the ban treaty. Specifically, I want to address the prohibition of threats to use nuclear weapons, as I think the International Court of Justice in its 8th of July 1996 advisory opinion sidestepped the issue of deterrence and prohibitions of threat of the use of force in self-defense. The second area is the impact on the TPNW on 3 things. Well, first is the illegality of nuclear weapons as a discourse. Second is the equality and equity debate. And third is where we're going to go next and how we shift intransigent positions of nuclear weapon states. And so we might think of these as hard and soft issues of doctrinal and discourse questions, but I really truly believe that they always will go hand in hand. First, concerning the obligations. Focus prior to the TPNW in particular has been on activities constituting the use or threat of use of nuclear weapons and whether these would be illegal or illegal. But there are a number of different potential activities surrounding nuclear weapons that feature in international law, including the obligation to pursue negotiations in good faith on nuclear disarmament that was mentioned by Jens as part of the NPT. But I think this is an obligation that far too many nuclear armed states and even non-nuclear states forget about. The ICJ, in that advisory opinion of 1996 on the threat or use of nuclear weapons, determined unanimously that there was no specific authorization of the threat or use of nuclear weapons, but also determined 11 votes to 3 that neither is there customary nor conventional international law any comprehensive universal prohibition of the threat or use of nuclear weapons as such. In many ways, however, the TPNW leaves this finding unchanged. There is only now a comprehensive provision for some states that are parties to a treaty, the TPNW, and it genuinely is comprehensive in its obligations. However, this is not a universal prohibition unless or until all states sign the treaty, or the obligation attains customary international law status. But even then, we might consider whether these nuclear armed states become what are known as persistent objectors in customary international law. What the International Court of Justice could not conclude, however, and the bench was divided on this question, 7 votes to 7 votes, with President Bajawi having the casting vote, was, in the view of the current state of international law, whether the threat or use of nuclear weapons would be lawful or unlawful in an extreme circumstance of self-defense in which the very survival of a state would be at stake. The TPNW has changed this position in respect of this conclusion for 68 states at least, who in an extreme situation where their survival is at stake cannot threaten to use or use nuclear weapons in self-defense due to Article 1 of the TPNW prohibiting their use. And it is this idea of the survival of the state that has become very important in discourse about self-defense. For a while, I think there's a lot of news reports, a lot of different interpretations, a lot of spokespeople associated with the Kremlin. It still seems as if Russia is saying it would only use nuclear weapons to defend the state. Although we know that there has been much stretching of the concept of self-defense in international law by states, including the US and the UK, in the past 20 years. So this doesn't necessarily give me much hope. And this is essentially a political, moral, and security question that I think the ICJ doesn't feel comfortable dealing with. And so it dealt with this issue or this idea of deterrence in a very unsatisfactory way. They explicitly even said that it did not intend to pronounce upon the practice known as the policy of deterrence. And I think it did this, or it could have done this, for a number of reasons. First, what's interesting is international law and the court in its reasoning combines threat of use and use, saying that notions of threat and use of force under Article 2.4 of the UN Charter stand together in the sense that it's the use of force itself. In a given case that is illegal for whatever reason, then the threat to use such force will likewise be illegal, which is entirely appropriate for the particular exercise the ICJ was conducting in relation to 2.4. But international law does not adopt the same position when it comes to self-defense. The whole point in 2.4, if I might get kind of legal theoretical for a moment here, is that we do not just prohibit the present, but also the present promise of a future aggression. And I argue that there is nothing that prevents us logically from extending the same to the act of self-defense. If we know a particular act will be illegal if it was used in self-defense, and illegal might mean contrary to IHL, international humanitarian law, as I'm sure Irene will go into more detail about. And the court did find in its conclusions that the use of nuclear weapons would generally be contrary to the rules applicable in armed conflicts. Then the present promise of such a future illegality could, as a matter of logic, policy, and principle, also be outlawed. Deterrence is explicitly a threat to use force in defense. NATO itself says deterrence is a threat of force in order to discourage an opponent from taking unwelcome advantage. They continue, this could be achieved through the threat of retaliation, which is deterrence by punishment, or by denying the opponent's war aims, deterrence by denial. And so I think the first thing to note here is that retaliation is not the same as self-defense NATO. Deterrence here is clearly a present promise of a future act. And the court further eluded dealing with this issue of deterrence, I think, by not really or not adequately dealing with the idea of proportionality in the act of self-defense, which involves this use of force, of nuclear force. Here is where threat and use should be relinked, and what applies to use in the first instance should apply to self-defense. The court argued that if the use of force itself in a given case is illegal for whatever reason, the threat of use of such force will likewise be illegal. But what if we were to just add self-defense to this? If the use of force in self-defense itself in a given case is illegal for whatever reason, the threat to use such force in self-defense should likewise be illegal. The question must be raised when the use of nuclear weapons could ever be used proportionately to achieve the purposes of self-defense. And while I'm sure my colleague Irene will touch more on the law of armed conflict, I'm not sure whether it could ever be proportionate to create conditions of, for example, global famine, which even a limited nuclear conflict could result in. Scientists have also showed that in the 2 years after such limited nuclear conflict, 5,341,000,000 people would die as a result of famine. And a global winter could start a 1,000-year-long nuclear ice age. This is never proportionate. And contrary to NATO's advice that deterrence could be a threat of retaliation, any threat of self-defense should not be punishing, but only what is necessary and proportionate. So if the use of nuclear weapons in self-defense would be illegal, then so must be their threat. And so cutting through the court's observations, considerations, and discussions, I think there is a tacit position of the court that authorizes the threat, but not the use of nuclear weapons in acts of self-defense. This is inherent to the policy of deterrence, but we never found this out. The court never examined this because it sidestepped it. The next part of the obligations I want to discuss is the relationship of the NPT and TPNW. Because on the face of it, there are two different regimes governing nuclear weapons, which appear to have created conflicting obligations. This is certainly what France, the UK, and the US want us to believe. Let us note, of course, their general positions on nuclear weapons and their motivations in so saying. And they claim the TPNW would undermine the existing international security architecture, which contributes to the maintenance of international peace and security. But rather than undermining the NPT, the TPNW could be interpreted as the fulfillment of Articles 6 and 7 of the treaty in particular. Article 6 obliges state parties to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to cessation of the nuclear arms race and early dates, and to nuclear disarmament, and on a treaty on general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control. Now, the obligation contained in Article 6 has been said or argued at least to have achieved the customary of international law status. Regardless of whether or not this is true, the TPNW is that treaty mentioned in Article 6. the treaty that is referred to on general and complete disarmament under strict and effective international control. And therefore, the state parties that participated in the negotiating conference of the TPNW were fulfilling their NPT and customary international law potentially obligations. Of course, the hope at the time was that the NPT would eventually be replaced in its entirety by a new treaty on general and complete disarmament, but this has not happened. Instead, the UK in its 2021 Integrated Review of Security, Defence, Development and Foreign Policy decided to increase its stockpile of nuclear warheads to no more than 260. In comparison, in 2010, the UK had originally announced to reduce its total nuclear weapons stockpile to 180, and then to operationally available warheads to 120 by the mid-2020s. And instead, we are seeing a reversal of that. And I have written elsewhere on why I think this violates their NPT obligations. As for Article 7 of the NPT, which explicitly states that nothing in this treaty affects the right of any group of states to conclude regional treaties in order to assure the total absence of nuclear weapons in their respective territories, Article 7 then would seem to reject the idea proffered by some states that the NPT is undermined by the presence of the TPNW. Instead, it makes room for the suggestion that the TPNW ought to be welcomed and that treaty obligations under the TPNW would take priority over any under the NPT. It is not the regional treaty, no, as is mentioned in Article 7, but its ratification has in effect been regional. The general takeaway from this article of the NPT, however, is that state parties wanted to increase the number of areas of the world where they were nuclear weapon-free zones, and the TPNW certainly helps achieve that. The last two obligations I want to mention are found in Articles 6 and 7 and Article 12 of the TPNW. First are the obligations of colonial powers and nuclear armed states to clear up their mess and make reparations. Articles 6 and 7 addresses for the first time the idea of victim assistance and environmental remediation, and these are important elements of the TPNW. Article 6 requires each state party with individuals affected by the use or testing of nuclear weapons to provide adequate medical care, assistance, and with respect to the environment, they also have obligations to control contamination as a result of activities relating to testing or use. But this leaves the risk of leaving the post-colonial world to clear up the mess in the first instance, not least because those states that caused the mess are not state parties to the TPNW, at least not yet. The Article 7 indicates that this is without prejudice to any duty or obligation that it may have under international law, a state party that has used or tested nuclear weapons or any other nuclear explosive device which have a responsibility to provide adequate assistance to affected state parties. And here there's an important point, and they've somewhat muddied the water in terms of the order or hierarchy between which states must bear the burden. I personally think that it's a straightforward interpretation of Article 7 is that Article 6 is without prejudice to pre-existing obligations, meaning those states who have primary responsibilities are those who have used or tested nuclear weapons. And here's an example. Given the closeness of its anniversary in just a few days, the 13th of February 1960, let's pick on France, because France tested its first nuclear weapon in the Algerian Sahara, codename Gerbois Blau, so blue jerboa, which is a rodent found in the deserts of Arabia and North Africa. Let's leave aside that they decided that it would be appropriate to call something happening in the Algeria Sahara a rodent. But between those, in 6 years between 1960 and 1966, France detonated a total of 70 nuclear bombs in the Algerian Sahara. 63 years later, France is yet to clean up the mess left behind. On the 60th anniversary, an Algerian general called out France to take responsibility. And while France has said it will compensate the victims, only one Algerian has received compensation of these tests to date. But so long as France is not a state party to the TPNW, we can do very little about this. The last article of TPNW that I want to explore is a neat little article on universality. For each state party is encouraged shall encourage states that are not already a party to the treaty to sign, ratify, accept, approve, accede to the treaty with the goal of universal ratification. This is the first of its kind, to my knowledge, an obligation to encourage non-state parties to sign a treaty like this until it is universally accepted. Of course, how this can be realised in practice is not yet known. There's a question of, can states not just encourage positively states to sign, but also negatively? Could states employ the strategy of what is known in IR as issue linkage to encourage sign up? If we do this trade deal, you must sign up. If you want to negotiate a better investment agreement, you must sign up. And while this might be fanciful in terms of a balance of power, it is interesting as an idea. And turning now to these final considerations on security discourse, equality, equity, and where we go next. Because important is what the impact of the TPNW will have on state behaviour, and whether it can shift the intransigent positions of nuclear weapon states as a result of changing general opinion about nuclear weapons. And I think it has the potential to do so, to disrupt the discourse about deterrence and MAD, this mutually assured destruction concept, which is rooted in ideas of security and realist international relations discourses. The TPNW, its adherence, and Article 12 obligation to encourage other states to join has the power, if used widely, to replace that discourse of security with ideas of illegality and humanity. So doing might change the discourse in domestic societies, influence domestic politics and governments, and the international community's thinking and positioning on nuclear weapons. Discourse is an important way of changing the deadlock. Algeria, when they were demonstrated this during their protest of the 60th anniversary of those tests, mentioning the TPNW in their arguments. And so we are seeing the increasing deployment of the TPNW in such settings, and it therefore has a soft power before the hard law obligations. The treaty also fundamentally changes the dynamics and reestablishes the equality of states in fact, as opposed to before the law. And here is the important point of critique of law comes in. You can be equal before the law without the law distributing rights and duties equally. The NPT is rightly being criticised for being an inequitable instrument of international law, which codifies the material inequalities between states. Most states would be prohibited from ever obtaining nuclear weapons, whereas 5 major powers were permitted tacitly to continue to stockpile and manufacture. Indeed, India refused to accede initially to the NPT on the grounds that it was biased and divided the world into the haves and the have-nots. Of course, inherent to the negotiation of the NPT was the idea that nuclear weapon states would not, non-nuclear weapon states would not acquire nuclear weapons in exchange for nuclear weapon states to their commitment to disarm, but this commitment has not been realised. Therefore, we might see the TPNW as an attempt to establish equity and punish nuclear states for not shifting their position, for not taking their NPT obligations seriously enough, by instead their continuing of the status quo of proliferation rather than disarmament. The tactic very much appears to instead shift the world around them, so that nuclear armed states or pro-nuclear states wake up one day in a very different global order where their having of nuclear weapons is seen as belonging to a dark age of proliferation and conflict. How we get to that new global order is the real question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Gail. I think your last question is excellent, and unfortunately, we're not there yet. Without too many more words, let me hand over to Irini of the ICRC. Very much looking forward to your presentation and to hear more about ICRC's work on these issues as well. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Sari, and good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be on this panel in this seminar. And I listened very carefully to the presentations of both Jens and Gail. I found both of them really, really good and informative. So I will try to round it up, focusing on another branch of law that is very relevant when it comes to the use of nuclear weapons, that is international humanitarian law, which is, of course, at the core of the mandate of the International Committee of the Red Cross, who I represent here today. So after the devastating atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki after the Second World War, it became clear that nuclear weapons are, at least to date, possibly the most destructive weapons ever created, and that their continued existence today is one of the biggest threats for humanity. And given their catastrophic humanitarian consequences, nuclear disarmament is an urgent humanitarian imperative. For those states that are party to the NPT, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, nuclear disarmament is more than a humanitarian imperative. It is actually a legal obligation stemming from the NPT's Article 6, as both Jens and Gail already mentioned. So the ICRC was present in the aftermath of the horrific bombings of Hiroshima, and we tried with the Japanese Red Cross Society in near impossible conditions to assist the hundreds of thousands of injured and dying civilians after the bomb exploded. And ever since, we have been calling for the prohibition and complete elimination of nuclear weapons. Now, the debate around nuclear weapons has traditionally been dominated by geopolitical arguments and national defense theories. And nuclear weapons have been viewed and continue indeed to be viewed by many states as a tool to ensure national and regional security and as a tool to maintain geostrategic balance. And Jens spoke to this at length. In 2010, the then president of the International Committee of the Red Cross made an appeal to states to view nuclear weapons differently through the lens of humanity and international humanitarian law. International humanitarian law, IHL, in shorthand, prohibits and regulates the use of certain categories of weapons in situations of armed conflict. The aim of these prohibitions is to protect civilians, to protect the natural environment, and even to protect combatants, soldiers, against the harm certain weapons cause, where this harm exceeds what is necessary from a military point of view, and where this harm caused by the weapons contravenes the very principle of humanity. So what does it mean to look at nuclear weapons through the lens of humanity? And I start with this because it's a necessary prerequisite to then speaking about the legality or illegality. During the past 2 decades, thanks to the efforts of many, not just the ICRC, but civil society and a growing number of states, the whole debate around nuclear weapons has been reframed in humanitarian terms, beyond the arguments that focus on military and security issues. And this shift has been critical because it brought to the fore the notion of human security. Human security is a concept that encompasses individual and collective health and well-being, but beyond that, also environmental security, food security, climate security. So human security goes beyond national and regional security and defense. It really relates to the very future of our planet and of humanity as a whole. And human security is gravely threatened by the continued existence of nuclear weapons. And why is it so important to focus on the consequences of nuclear weapons? Because these consequences are the benchmark against which the moral, ethical, and legal acceptability of a weapon is to be judged. And indeed, the benchmark against which deterrence theories are to be evaluated. So while the purpose, or at least the professed purpose of nuclear deterrence is to maintain national and regional security, the existence of nuclear weapons poses major risks to human security. And it's the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of these weapons that make them inhuman, immoral, and since the entry into force of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, also illegal under conventional international law. So what does it mean now to look at nuclear weapons through the lens of international humanitarian law? The applicability of IHL to the use of nuclear weapons is not contested. Let me start by this. Even the International Court of Justice in the famous 1996 advisory opinion confirmed that the rules and principles of IHL apply to nuclear weapons. The review conference of the NPT in 2010 also confirmed this. The outcome document reaffirmed the need for all states at all times to comply with applicable international law, including international humanitarian law. And of course, the TPNW that Gail spoke at length about is explicitly based on the principles and rules of IHL. As with any weapon, the legality or illegality of the use of nuclear weapons is assessed on the basis of the foreseeable effects of the use of the weapon. Now, Jens and Gail spoke a bit about these effects as well, and we have seen them not just in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, but also in the nuclear tests around the world, albeit on a lesser scale. Nuclear weapons, when they detonate, release immense quantities of heat and kinetic energy and prolonged radiation, and the destructive power released is impossible to contain in space and time, meaning that it would result, and it has resulted, as we have seen, in incalculable human suffering, especially if they are used in or near populated areas like cities. And studies of the ICRC, the UN, and other organizations have shown that today there is no adequate humanitarian response capacity in case of use of nuclear weapons, especially if the weapon is used against targets in or near populated areas. And studies, including recent studies, have shown that a nuclear conflict would really have catastrophic effects on human health, on the environment, on climate, on food production, on socioeconomic development, and even potentially cause irreversible harm to future generations. In an armed conflict, it is the view of the ICRC that it is extremely doubtful that nuclear weapons could ever be used in accordance with international humanitarian law. And the rules and principles that are most relevant here, and I will address a bit more in detail, are the principle of distinction, the prohibition of indiscriminate attacks, the prohibition of disproportionate attacks, the principle of precaution, in particular, the obligation to take all feasible precautions in attack to avoid or minimize harm on civilians, the prohibition of using weapons that are of a nature to cause what we call superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering, and lastly, the rules relevant to the protection of the natural environment in armed conflict. These rules and principles apply to the use of nuclear weapons, even in situations of national self-defense. And Gail already spoke about self-defense from more of a use of force, law on the use of force perspective. Now I will speak about self-defense from an international humanitarian law perspective. In its advisory opinion, the International Court of Justice, as you probably all know, stated rather ambiguously that it was unable to conclude definitively whether the threat or use of nuclear weapons would be lawful or unlawful in the extreme circumstance of self-defense in which the very survival of the state was at stake. The ICRC's position is that when exercising a lawful right to self-defense, even in this extreme situation where the very survival of the state is at stake, self-defense must be exercised in full compliance with the rules and principles of international humanitarian law. In other words, self-defense does not allow using weapons that are prohibited under international humanitarian law, whatever the circumstances. In the view of the ICRC, there are two scenarios in which the use of nuclear weapons would clearly violate IHL. The first one is a bit intuitive, but looking at nuclear doctrines, at least the declassified parts of them, it's extremely concerning to see that this scenario is not unlikely at all. This is the scenario where a nuclear weapon is directed against civilian populations or civilian objects, like entire cities, or not directed against a specific military objective, so fired indiscriminately. This use would violate the principle of distinction, which prohibits attacks that directed against civilians or civilian objects, as well as attacks that are not directed against a specific lawful target military objective. Only one nuclear armed state, as far as we know today, and that was relatively recently, has stated publicly and unequivocally in their nuclear doctrine that they would never use nuclear weapons against civilians or civilian objects. If we look at declassified nuclear target lists from the Cold War era, we see that nuclear doctrines, at least at the time, typically planned for systematic destruction of major cities of the adversary. And cities are, of course, concentrations of civilians, and as such, can never become a lawful target under IHL. And today, if you ask nuclear possessor states on what scenarios they envisage they would use nuclear weapons and how these scenarios would comply with the law, the answers are usually opaque and blurry, to say the least. The second scenario, where use of nuclear weapons would be clearly unlawful under IHL, is when nuclear weapon is used against a military objective, a lawful target that is inside or near a populated area, a city or other concentration of cities. Now, this use would violate the prohibitions of indiscriminate and disproportionate attacks. Indiscriminate attacks include attacks that use a weapon whose effects cannot be controlled in time or space. Knowing what we know about the effects of a nuclear detonation, we can tell with certainty that it is not possible to contain neither the radiation that emerges from the detonation of a nuclear weapon, nor usually the fires and firestorms that come as a result of the immense heat released when a nuclear weapon detonates. Fire radiation cannot be controlled in time and space, and by this fact alone, an attack with a nuclear weapon against a target in a populated area or near a populated area would be an indiscriminate attack. If you think of nuclear fallout, the famous colloquial term, and how it can be, and it can typically be carried away by wind or seep into the soil, the water courses, in plants, and then animals and down the food chain, you realize that it is impossible to contain the harmful effects of nuclear radiation once a nuclear weapon detonates. Even the use of a so-called low-yield nuclear weapon, and we spoke about this a bit, in or near a populated area would still have these effects that cannot be limited as required by IHL. They cannot be controlled in time or space. And the ICJ, in its advisory opinion, confirmed that the destructive power of nuclear weapons cannot be contained in either space or time, and therefore the use of such weapons seems scarcely reconcilable with respect for the prohibition of indiscriminate attacks, among other IHL rules. Gail mentioned the rule of proportionality. Proportionality basically requires that for each attack, the civilian harm expected to be caused by the attack should not be excessive compared to the military advantage to be gained by the attack. If you consider the devastating direct but also indirect effects of a nuclear weapon use, and by indirect I mean all those that will die because the infrastructure in a large range around the detonation will be obliterated, no hospitals, no emergency services, no essential services, water, electricity, then you realize that it is impossible to imagine a military advantage that would justify devastation at such a large scale. And just for reference, in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, after the atomic bombs exploded, over 80% of medical facilities were destroyed. Over 90% of doctors and nurses were killed or injured. It was practically impossible to provide any kind of emergency or midterm assistance to even those who managed to survive the immediate aftermath of the detonation. Now, some states have argued that there are some scenarios where nuclear weapons can be used lawfully. For example, using a low-yield nuclear weapon or tactical nuclear weapon, if you want, against warships on the high seas or against enemy troops in the desert, so in remote areas. Now, one question is how probable these scenarios are, as opposed to really exceptional and rather hypothetical cases. But another question, legally speaking, is that even in such scenarios, there are other rules of IHL that would very likely be violated by the use of nuclear weapons. The first one is the prohibition of using weapons of a nature to cause superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering. Superfluous injury or unnecessary suffering is harm that goes beyond what is needed to achieve a legitimate military objective. And the ICJ recognized in 1996 that due to their unique characteristics, nuclear weapons use is scarcely reconcilable with respect for this cardinal rule of IHL. So if you think of the fatal levels of radiation, the immediate and long-term consequences, not just the injuries right in the aftermath of detonation, but also the cancers and other illnesses that appear much later, and even there are evidence of transgenerational impact of radiation in descendants of survivors. This lifelong suffering caused by exposure to radiation makes it extremely doubtful that nuclear weapons could ever be used in compliance with IHL, even in such remote area use scenarios. In addition, even when used in remote areas, we know the horrific impact, long-term, widespread, that nuclear weapons use and radiation release causes to the natural environment due to the dispersion of dust, soot, radioactive particles. Now, the natural environment is also a civilian object, which is often disregarded when talking about IHL in armed conflict. And IHL contains rules that protect the natural environment against severe, long-term, widespread damage by the use of weapons. So it's extremely doubtful that using nuclear weapons, even in the desert or on the high seas, would comply with these rules protecting the natural environment. Not to mention, once again, that radiation and nuclear fallout cannot be contained. So it's very likely that it would be carried downwind and even reach population centers, causing civilian harm. Any use of nuclear weapons, in addition to the strictly legal assessment, would also be abhorrent to the principles of humanity and the dictates of public conscience. This was also unanimously affirmed by the International Court of Justice. And the dictates of public conscience and the principles of humanity are a sort of a fallback safeguard for when the law does not specifically prohibit a certain weapon. The use of a weapon must still comply with these fundamental principles of humanity and the dictates of public conscience. This was very relevant at the time. Today, we have the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which specifically prohibits these weapons, but the Martens Clause, as this principle is referred to, is still very relevant. And I would like to finish just with a few words about threat of use of nuclear weapons, just because Gail also mentioned it. For the ICRC, any threat to use of nuclear weapons is equally abhorrent to the principles of humanity and the dictates of public conscience. And this refers to both general threats and specific threats. And threat of use of nuclear weapons, unfortunately, has come to the fore very starkly against the backdrop of the international armed conflict in Ukraine, with the open and implicit threats of use of nuclear weapons that we have heard. So today, the threat of use is, of course, prohibited under the TPNW. But as Gail mentioned, the ICJ also clearly stated that if an envisaged use of weapons would be unlawful under international humanitarian law, then the threat to use these weapons would also be contrary to international humanitarian law. At the heart of debates on the threat of use lies, of course, the more sensitive issue of the legal but also ethical acceptability of nuclear deterrence theories and mutually assured destruction theories. Now, some contend, of course, that nuclear deterrence has prevented the use of nuclear weapons since 1945. Setting aside the fact that this premise is highly contested, over the last 77 or so years, we have seen on several occasions that we have come extremely close to nuclear catastrophe by miscalculation or error. And these near catastrophic incidents, where we came very close to use of nuclear weapons, expose the inherent weakness in the belief that nuclear deterrence theories can guarantee security and stability. And they expose the unacceptable risk that nuclear deterrence theories actually entail. So legally speaking, and just to make it clear, nuclear deterrence is not in and of itself threat of use of nuclear weapons. So we cannot say that nuclear deterrence as such is prohibited under IHL, just to make it clear. However, as a humanitarian organization, obviously the ICRC cannot but reject, as contrary to the principles of humanity and the dictates of public conscience, any security theories that actually practically rely on the threat of mass suffering and destruction. So I'll stop here and looking forward to it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think that you can keep your camera on as well, Irene, and also Gail, and slowly Jens and Emilia as well as we get into the questions and answers. Thank you, everybody. I think this was very interesting. We have and also very concrete and actually quite worrying. We have a number of questions, so I'll start with a question to Irene and then to Gail, and then we'll also have a question to some questions to all of the panelists. First, a very concrete one to Irene. I mean, excellent presentation, and but we have a question about what is the ICRC actually doing? I mean, how are you actually working in order to try to convince states about these legal arguments in the current geopolitical setting? And a concrete question to Gail as well. It was towards the end of the presentation, you got into the sort of post-colonial analysis of nuclear weapons. And on that note, is there a sort of actual ongoing political debate on cleaning up these old sites where the nuclear weapons have been tested? So over to you, Irene, and then Gail.
Yes, thank you very much for this question. So nuclear disarmament is an issue where the ICRC has been actively working on since 1945. Concretely, we do this in different ways and on different levels. First and foremost, we do a lot of advocacy and research along with national Red Cross, Red Crescent societies to raise awareness about the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons. And this may seem unimportant, but in fact, it has proven critical in shifting the nuclear weapons debate, as I said at the very beginning of my presentation, from the narrow focus on military and defense theories to the broader focus on the human and the effects of the weapon. And it was this shift in the debate that eventually led to the negotiation and adoption of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We also conduct some research and raise awareness over the risks of use of nuclear weapons, which are sort of the other side of the medal, if you want. The ICRC was closely involved in the negotiation of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. We continue to attend the meetings of state parties and the preparations and contribute our expertise. The ICRC's role is actually established in the treaty itself, as well as the entire movement of the Red Cross and Red Crescent. We assist states also in the interpretation of the different provisions of the TPNW, concretely by publishing a number of legal interpretive guidance on different provisions of the treaty, and one of them is going to be published very soon, is on the positive obligations on victim assistance and environmental remediation that Gail, you mentioned earlier. We also engage in the context of the NPT, where we are in dialogue with NPT states, including nuclear weapon states and allies, to promote risk reduction measures, which, pending the elimination of nuclear weapons, are obviously an urgent priority. And the fourth pillar of our work is legal analysis of the legality of nuclear weapons under IHL. And we published last year our legal and policy position of nuclear weapons. And the last point I want to mention is that in all of this, we work very closely with national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies around the world, which, including in particular, I should say, in NATO member states, are in close dialogue with their governments on risk reduction measures and other steps towards nuclear disarmament. So it's very much not only ICRC's work, but really joint work of the Red Cross and Red Crescent movement.
And to address the question, just maybe this is quite a good jump off point from what Irene was just saying. So yes, I mean, there is a lot of political debate, mostly again outside the global minority, if you like, and in the spaces of the global majority, why should, if they sign up to the TPNW, they'll get landed with obligations to assist victims in environmental remediation within their jurisdiction, when they simply can't afford it. And so there's actually Kiribati in Kazakhstan that we're working on the implementation of Articles 6 and 7. They've had meetings with kind of academics and activists, and they presented proposals about how Articles 6 and 7 of the TPNW can be realised at the first meeting of state parties. How would they go about it? Should they have a victim-centred approach? How do you recognise human rights within this? Should we recognise social economic rights, etc.? But yes, at the end of the day, you can't move away from the fact that unless the likes of France, the likes of the US, the likes of the UK sign up to the TPNW, it's incredibly difficult to secure their contributions to victim assistance and environmental remediation under the TPNW. And the reason why I say under the TPNW is there is existing international law, and on state responsibility for actions that result from nuclear weapons tests. And I don't think we should forget that these obligations to make remediation already exist on these states. So just, don't divert too much attention to the TPNW, because there are already existing obligations in international law, I think. And yeah, there is an obligation, of course, to make remediation for the harm that has been caused, including to their own citizens who have been a part of the tests. It has also been hushed. Yeah, so, and I mean, it's a very important debate, and unfortunately we do not hear enough about it in the global minority, but it features very much, especially in those states like Kazakhstan that have been kind of at the brunt of nuclear weapons testing.
Excellent, thank you so much. I think we're going to hop into, we'll use this opportunity to hop into a broader discussion where also Jens is welcome back into the camera field. So we have 3 questions that I think would be interesting to hear from all 3 of you on. We'll start with 2 that I think they're a little bit related, even though they're asking about different things, but it's sort of the typology of nuclear weapons. So we have one question that reads as follows. So all of the nuclear weapon states are modernizing their nuclear weapon arsenals, and the US is placing the new B6112 in Europe. Does this not go against the non-proliferation treaty, and how can it be handled in that treaty, is one question. And a separate one is about also sort of the typology and the development of different weapons. So it asks, there is a wide argument that small tactical nuclear weapons are not that dangerous, that they would not cause nuclear winter and so forth. Is it meaningful and feasible to distinguish between different kinds of nuclear weapons, whether to promote disarmament or just in the legal arena? So I don't know if Jens wants to take a first look at it before Galen he give the legal perspectives, but I thought these 2 kind of were combinable in a way. So if you have any reflections on that, it would be very interesting.
Okay, thank you for the questions. Let me give it a first shot. There are certainly modernizations ongoing, and I think you have to differentiate a bit about different kinds of modernization. I mean, at one end of the spectrum, there are modernizations that are aimed to increase the safety and security of the nuclear weapons themselves. For example, you could replace, let's not get too much into physics now, but you could, for example, replace the high explosives package, which is also in the nuclear weapon, by a more robust high explosive that detonates with more difficulty. So that's a safety improvement. You could argue that this is a modernization because you're replacing an old high explosive with a new variant. But I think this is something that increases the safety and security. So I think that's certainly welcome, I would say. I mean, as long as nuclear weapons exist, I think it's paramount that they remain as safe and secure as possible. Then there are modernizations like, for example, the US modernization of the B61 and the new B6112 version of the B61 family, which it doesn't really enhance. I mean, it doesn't expand the arsenal, and it doesn't really expand in terms of quality either, because it doesn't add really any new features that doesn't already exist in the US arsenal, for example. So, I mean, you should remember that although they are placed in Europe, these are US nuclear weapons under US command and control. So I think it doesn't add any new capabilities. So in that sense, it doesn't go against even the spirit of the NPT. But then I think you also have to be a bit practical. I mean, it takes 2 to tango. So it's very hard also when you have expansions and diversification of nuclear capabilities in, for example, Russia and China, and still demand that, let's say, the US, the UK, and France should continue on a sort of monotonic path towards full nuclear disarmament. I don't think the world works that way. It would be, you could argue that it would almost be irresponsible towards NATO and extended deterrence that the US has, for example, to sort of not take into account and not calculate with what opponents are doing. So so that's for modernization, and when it comes to sort of different kinds of nuclear weapons, I think one reason why we have seen arms control agreements on strategic nuclear forces, and also before on sort of intermediate range nuclear forces, although that doesn't exist any longer, is to at least try to grapple with the fact that the largest nuclear weapons, I mean, in terms of explosive yield, for example, have the most devastating consequences. But then, as has already been emphasized earlier, I think, depending on exactly how and when you use even a so-called low yield nuclear weapon, I mean, the effects could be devastating as well, at least on a local level. Although I would agree that you perhaps shouldn't speak about a nuclear winter, but at least, you know, on a sort of local/regional level, the consequences are potentially devastating anyway. So thanks. I would be happy to hear opposite views now. Thanks.
Thank you. Gail or Irini, is it something you want to, maybe Gail, if you want to go ahead, or?
Just because we'd finished on maybe the topic of tactical weapons versus strategic weapons. So a tactical weapon, I believe, is anything that could be a fraction of a kiloton to 50 kilotons. And for context, Hiroshima was 15 kilotons. So it would be technically seen as a tactical weapon, and that still killed 700,000 people. So tactical weapons have huge capacity to destroy. Strategic weapons start at 100 kilotons. So we are talking, I'm terrible at maths here, but almost 6 times the amount of the Hiroshima bomb is a strategic weapon nowadays. So Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs were both, so 15 and 20 respectively, they were both technically tactical weapons based on current amounts. And of course, it is possible to have a fraction of a kiloton, of course. But the idea of any use of a nuclear weapon is to utterly destroy that which it has targeted, even if you're trying to contain, for example, the radiation. So you're still then intending an entirely disproportionate, indiscriminate, full-on destructive potential by using a small amount of kilotons, if you like. Then there's the other issue of if a state uses a tactical nuclear weapon against another state, the risk of escalation will be huge. If the US uses it against Russia, a tactical weapon, even of 2 kilotons, there is that moment of panic where you worry that something much stronger has been used against you, so you respond with full force. Then there's the risk that even if you're just going 2 kilotons, 4 kilotons, 6 kilotons, there's a risk of escalation and continual back and forth of tactical weapons. These would be incredibly problematic. But as I say, I think there is that moment of when a nuclear weapon has been used against you, you panic as a person, as the head of state, and do you go for the nuclear, if you like, option of 100 kiloton strategic weapon in reaction to a kiloton being used? In 2018, the then Secretary of Defense of the US said that he did not think there was any such thing as a tactical nuclear weapon. Any nuclear weapon used at any time is a strategic game changer. And many leaders have said that they would view any nuclear attack as the start of an all-out war. So escalation here is hugely problematic. So first, I would dispute that tactical weapons aren't all that damaging. I would dispute whether tactical weapons could ever be used in accordance with the law of armed conflict, and there is the risk of escalation. So yes, I think this is a really important point. I don't think we can forget. And sorry, I forgot the other question, Emilia. Can you remind me?
It was about the placing
modernizing
of the 6112 in Europe.
Yeah. So the UK government, when they were modernizing their Trident missiles, tried to argue that it was in line with their NPT obligations. And I mean, I dispute this, but arguably you could say, so all you are doing is upgrading. This is a slightly different question from increasing the number of nuclear warheads. The UK has actually taken a decision to increase its nuclear warheads, which I have argued goes against the object and purpose of the NPT and would violate their Article 6 obligation. And I've argued this elsewhere, and I'm happy to, I think there's a paper on my SSRM page if anyone's interested in reading, but it would violate their Article 6 NPT obligations. I also think that upgrading nuclear weapons when you're trying to make them somehow smarter is equally as problematic. You're still investing in advancing the technology, but I definitely think increasing nuclear warheads violates NPT obligations.
Irini, do you want to add? Irini, do you want to add anything to these viewpoints?
Sure. Very briefly, because I agree with much of what has been said. So, okay, tactical nuclear weapons, definitely agree. The scale of devastation is different, and we would probably, as Jens said, not speak of nuclear winter after the use of a tactical nuclear weapon. Now, that's one thing. Legally speaking, all the rules of IHL that I have mentioned that would either be violated or almost certainly be violated, the same would apply to the use of a tactical nuclear weapon, because we are looking at the attack as a whole and not necessarily only at what would happen 2, 5, 10 years down the line, and that we don't have to have a nuclear winter for IHL to be violated. So legally speaking, it wouldn't make a big difference. And I would fully agree with Gail as well on the risk of lowering the threshold of use by developing smaller tactical nuclear weapons, easier to use, even for conventional battlefield use. So lowering the threshold of use, which in turn increases the risk of use, and fully agree with the risk of escalation. And that's something that struck me also in Jens, your initial presentation, when you said nuclear weapons are no longer political weapons, but they are weapons for conventional conflict management. They are not just there for deterrence, but also for defense. And this is something that we saw clearly also in the declassified parts of the nuclear posture review of the US, where integrated deterrence has taken a central concept. And integrated deterrence is precisely conventional and tactical nuclear sort of combined. So this for me is a very worrying development, again, because it makes the use of nuclear weapons easier and more likely as it becomes more and more normalized in military planning and also in the media and in political discourse. And on modernization, I would agree with both Jens and Gail in a sense that if it is maintenance, repairs, absolute necessary for safety, then obviously I wouldn't see any issues there. But if it's anything beyond that, I would agree with Gail that in my view, it would also be contrary to the object and purpose of NPT's Article 6, again, insofar as it is further investing and making the use of nuclear weapons easier or more likely.
Thank you so much. Sari, do you want to give out a last question before we wrap?
Yes, I do, when I find my unmute button. We actually have two last questions, and they seem to be quite opposite from each other. One is to all the three speakers, what would be the top priority of each speaker for concretely promoting nuclear disarmament in the current geopolitical situation? And then the second one is, couldn't nuclear weapons be seen as a necessary evil given the violent history of humankind? here the person who asked the questions make references to Jens noting that the answer to Russia's invasion of Ukraine might have been different if Russia wouldn't have had nuclear weapons. But in a similar vein, the person who asked the question says, but if Iraq actually would have had nuclear weapons, maybe the consequences there also would have been different. So two questions that are quite different, one on disarmament and the second is on realpolitik and necessary evil. I don't know if we should go in the opposite direction, starting with Irini and then Gail and finishing with Jens. If you have any closing words that you want to throw in, don't hesitate.
Happy to start. So top priority, again, I would insist on refocusing the debate on the human element, especially against the current backdrop in the international security or insecurity, I should say. We see deterrence theories coming more and more to the fore and regaining strength, and this normalization of nuclear weapons in the political and military discourse and even on the media. And I think it's now more important than ever that we bring back the focus on the human element, on what even a use of a tactical smaller yield nuclear weapon would actually concretely mean for people and for the environment, to counterbalance this narrative that is highly concerning. And on the second question, I would say, if that was the thought process, then probably all of the weapons with indiscriminate or inhuman effects that have been prohibited across decades would still be lawful. Chemical, biological, anti-personnel mines, cluster munitions, and what have you. So I think it is the role of the law also to evolve in tandem with our principles of humanity, rather than accepting weapons as a necessary evil. If we had done that, then nothing would be prohibited right now, and obviously we would see a lot more suffering in armed conflict than what is still unfortunately the case.
So whether it's a necessary evil, I'm going to deal with that first so I can end on a positive note this time. I don't think humankind is actually so bad, if I'm entirely honest with you, but maybe all the way from Machiavelli to contemporary IR security discourse, they want us to think that. But I mean, I have very little time for IR kind of hawkish realist theories about the world. I just don't. This is just the world that they would like to project. And as a good social constructivist, I know that, of course, if that's what we believe, then that's the world that we create. So I would utterly challenge this idea that humankind is so bad. But in the same way as the narrative is that the US and UK are arming in response to developments in Russia and China, their narrative is that they're arming in response to the US and the UK, increasing their capacity, increasing their technologies on their weapons. And so we just end up in a very zero-sum game with every state in the world having nuclear weapons, which would definitely lead to nuclear catastrophe. That's just a horrendous situation that would be utterly that's the logic of where that argument goes. So better then is to have no states with any nuclear weapons, and so it's how we achieve that. And so this is where maybe my top priority of to achieve it. And I think this has been true of the landmines, of cluster munitions. There's been a concerted NGO kind of response at this at the level of communities, and to change governments to shift their positions on this. One of the things I found actually most inspiring or most interesting about the TPNW, and well, in particular the ICANN appeal, was to have a cities appeal, where cities sign up essentially to the TPNW and to indicate their desire to ensure that their states sign the TPNW. And so I would encourage you to get in touch with your your local representatives and try and encourage cities to sign the cities appeal, because if all the cities in the world sign up to this, then we're going to start seeing shifts as well. Because I would ultimately like at some point for the US, Russia, the UK, France, China to wake up and realize that the world has moved on without them, and that they are the pariah states with nuclear weapons, and that can only happen if we make a concerted effort. And it might be idealistic, but I genuinely don't think this is going to happen with the US, UK, France, Russia, or China, India, or Pakistan taking the lead. It's just not feasible, and so it has to come from elsewhere.
Okay, so thanks for the questions. I am perhaps more pessimistic. I mean, I certainly agree with the previous speakers that I don't think humanity is sort of bad, made bad by nature in itself. But I do think that a number of states think that the nuclear weapons have benefited them so far. And I think that's an argument for why disarmament of nuclear weapons is going to be very difficult. And I think it's even more problematic if you place yourself in a palace in Pyongyang in DPRK. I mean, from the North Korean perspective, it does make sense, you know, given their worldview and their sort of threat assessments. It makes sense, you know, for Kim Jong-un to have a nuclear weapon program. That doesn't mean that I concur with his assessments, but you know, if you place yourself in his chair, you know, it seems to make too much sense, unfortunately, for seeing any progress immediately, at least. I think the sort of security environment has to improve before it's time to sort of tackle disarmament for real. But I do think in the meantime there are a number of other issues we can deal with, and I think risk reduction is one such. At least in this you know, security environment, I think it would be important to, as much as possible, lessen the risk of miscalculation or misunderstandings, etc., and to make nuclear weapon states have all the means available to lessen the risk that nuclear weapons are used. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you. I think we're going to end on that note, and it's some food for thought from all three of you. Sari, do you want to add something before I put a bow on it, so to say?
No, only a big thank you from the side of the law school to the speakers, and also obviously to the Joakim Dungel Association for each year working with us to make these seminars happen. So thank you.
Thank you. And that's a wrap. So before I let you go, just to mention that this year, 2023 marks the 100th anniversary of the School of Business, Economics and Law at Gothenburg University. So do keep an eye out for other upcoming events. And thank you so much again to our speakers, Jens Wistam, Gail Lithgow, and Eirini Giorgio. We're incredibly grateful to you, not just for joining us today, but for sharing such valuable insights. And again, a big thanks to Marie Örning, Jeffrey Jans, Karin Åberg, the Seminar Advisory Committee, and of course, Sari Kovo. And finally, to you, our audience, thank you so much for learning with us. Whether you watch this in real time or if you're tuning in later, it's been a true pleasure and an honor to have you here. So take care, everybody. We'll see you next year.